putting together or bringing people that are able to talk about how we are going to be adapting in our new world, which, as we know, is extremely challenging. Today, I am thrilled to bring Nicole Gravagna, Dr. Nicole Gravagna. She is president of Neuro EQ. And not only is she a neuroscientist, she is author of Mindset Your Manners, and she is co-author of Venture Capital for Dummies. What a brain you have. It is so lovely to have you here, Nicole.
Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
I'm excited to have you here because you have so much knowledge in so many different areas. You're not somebody like me that's evolved through corporate and wants to make the world a better place. You actually come from a scientific background. So I love it that you're here to talk about how we're going to move forward. But I want to ask you my very first question, which is, what are you stoked about in this new era?
We are addressing systemic racism in a way that we never have as a world. This is happening in companies. It's happening in families. It's happening in communities, and it seems to be really happening. It's not just being quickly addressed and then swept under the table as it has been in my lifetime.
When you say everywhere, you're an American in America. Do you see? When you're talking about systemic racism, are you thinking that this is primarily an American issue, or is this a global issue?
This is a global issue. And to bring that point forward, there are many conferences coming up that are addressing diversity and inclusion, generally in corporations, but also in government sectors and in other places. And the last one I was in was just centered in Europe. So this is not just an American issue. This is not an American issue.
Okay. Slightly off kind of script on our conversation here, because this is very interesting. You just said that this is happening in Europe as well. You were just involved in a conference, and I remember someone in the UK saying quite recently on this big thread about white privilege and white savioring and what have you. And there was this really interesting point that someone made in the UK. It was just an interesting point. I don't know if I agreed with him, but he said that the American everything that's happening in the media or everything that's happening in the States right now is basically echoing into the UK, and everybody is taking that narrative. And I'm thinking, are they? Is that the case? Or is this, again, like a systemic racism whereby people don't actually know what they don't know? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
It's a little bit hard to say because of time zones. And the reason I say that is that I suspect that the very European-centered conversations were happening while I was sleeping because of time zones. This is, and I will go back and watch those events and workshops and panels, but it does seem like although the US has its own brand of racism that's centered in our history, this is not an American issue. And there is a fundamental lack of equity based on race. Race is such I'm not even going to say skin color, because it's not exactly skin color. It seems to be much more than that.
Okay. So you're the first person to actually mention that. There's the serious issue that that white people just don't have that understanding, and there's a lot of confrontation about that, which is good. It's about time. It's been hundreds of years in the making for us to have this conversation, but it's like we could have two conversations here, and I don't know if we're going to be happy going down two different paths. But let's take the first path, which is where we are today with systemic racism. How are we as individuals and as organizations able to tackle that?
That's a big question. It's a big question.
Can you solve this, please? You're a doctor.
Well, it's what I think about every day. So I'm not saying it's an impossible question. It's just a very big question.
I know.
And we have a time limit, but we could go on for days. It's interesting because what we've done as organizations is in the past, we've tackled this in a specific way, a very cookie cutter way, a way that companies take diversity and inclusion as a program or an initiative or something that can be put into policy and law. And that has worked up till now. And just like any kind of transition over time, some things will work to a point, and then you won't get any more out of that process. So you have to change the process. And so companies now are starting to address this challenge in a way that is looking at it differently. And it used to be focused on there was a law, then there's compliance to a law, HR handles compliance to a law, and that you end up with policies and programs that come out of HR. And so that's how the companies have been handling it so far. You have hiring rules, quotas on how many of this kind of person, how many of this kind of person. And companies are now starting to recognize that we have to go beyond compliance to get to something that is much more personal. We value authenticity in the office. And when we don't have people who feel like they can show up as their true selves and be accepted as professionals, how can they possibly be authentic to bringing their whole self to work if their whole self is not valued as professional?
Mm-hmm. It's great that you say that, because clearly that was the system that organizations felt that was going to make the greatest impact, to tick those boxes. But the reality is that from a human perspective, our brains weren't adapting. We were just following rules and not actually realizing why those rules were created or what we needed to do about it from a social responsibility perspective. And
worse, you end up with, when you have rules, you end up with ways around those rules. So you end up with, okay, we have to put check these boxes for people to get hired. We have to make sure there's somebody of color, there's a woman, and then everybody else. And so then once we have those boxes checked, how can we get around it? Because we know who we really want to hire. And so people had ways around the rules that were put in place because it wasn't coming from the heart. It wasn't coming from an understanding of equity. It was coming from a set of compliance rules.
So there's clearly that gap. And if we look at it from the individual perspective, I remember seeing so frequently that recruiters need to stand up to be able to explain, who needs to be hired, or, what type of person needs to be hired. And the hiring managers will just say, no, get back in your box. So that has been problematic until today. But I think there's a greater awareness, but I still think there needs to be a tool for people to be able to get that. And what that tool is, I think is going to be
so many. So the things that the practitioners, other people who teach diversity, equity, and inclusion or coach, there's equity coaches, there are trainers, there are consultants. Generally, we're all focused right now on pushing for a piece that hasn't really been, companies have not been willing to put the effort into this in the past, but now they are. The piece that we're really pushing for is taking a long, hard look at where you're at right now and admitting that that's where you are and being okay with it. Like, the truth is the truth. So if this is where you are, great, let's analyze it. Let's put it into data. Let's document where this is. And so there's this reflectivity on what has been done in the past, what things could change easily to go forward. There's a great deal of analysis, and we have so much HR data that has come out of different systems that companies use in terms of turnover, in terms of hiring, in terms of people having more sick days or fewer sick days, people moving up faster, being promoted. And so these are all fabulous pieces of data that give us a really good picture of what's truly happening, not what we feel like is happening, but what is really happening. And when you look at that objectively, it becomes clear what's going on. And when you take that into consideration with also, we can measure company culture in a way that isn't just the values thing that's on the wall, but real deep company culture based on different departments and different levels of leadership. And when we do that, we can see where the blocks are going to be. When you have a company that is so focused on harmony and staying in a harmonious place, everybody working together without conflict, you can see very clearly how it's going to be troublesome to talk about something as painful as systemic racism, even if we're talking about what's happening to employees when they're not at work. So there's a ton of analysis that can happen here.
Very good. Thank you for that, because I think that's a lot of people don't know where to start. Sorry, jumbling my words. And when they don't know where to start, they'll just basically become the ostrich, put their head in the sand, and forget all about it, and hope that they'll be able to ride through whatever economic situation they're in. So it does take that kind of work, and it needs to come from the whole group. It needs to come from the entire C-suite, not just one person in one department where they can have their data rejected.
Well, so true. And the challenge here is that, like I said, this has generally been put into the HR department. HR department is a service department for the whole organization. It's not line leadership. And so there's only so much that HR can actually do. I mean, HR absolutely is in the right place. They're generally, the hearts are in the right place. They generally have seen a lot going on over the years, and they have access to the data. But in terms of being able to change cultures, because really what we're talking about here is a culture transformation towards equity. And when you're talking about a culture transformation, this cannot happen straight out of HR. HR is just not influential enough, not nearly as influential as line leadership, senior leadership, starting from the CEO down, or from the next layer of senior leadership, and infiltrating throughout the rest of the group in a way that looks much more like building a movement. Influential leadership is going to be key here for organizations. So the other piece of this too is like, okay, analysis to understand what's happening inside the organization, but then also to be able to truly deeply understand on a person by person level what needs to happen next. So there's a great deal of training that needs to happen here. And non-biased or unconscious bias training is only the tip of the iceberg of what's possible in terms of training. Anti-racism training is another one that's really popular right now. But there is ongoing training that's really important, not only for leadership, but for everybody, just to stay up on language, what's current, how to talk about this. Most of us didn't get trained in emotional intelligence. So being able to handle somebody's sense of being offended, and there's a great deal of sense of being offended by everybody, literally everybody. And those who aren't offended are often just better at hiding it. Right? We don't use the sense of somebody's offense as a way to drive what we learn to say or do.
Yeah.
You know, we're then at the whims of who gets to hide their emotions better than others. That's not a great directive.
It isn't. So I ask this question every time, which is, John Lewis is all about creating good trouble. What good trouble are you creating, Nicole?
Oh my gosh, so much trouble.
Gotta go.
This is in truth a conflict. When you're talking about systemic culture change in an organization or in the world, you're talking about conflict itself. Conflict is what happens when something is one way and then it's going to become another way. There's that meniscus between the two sides. And that meniscus is the conflict, where we don't know what the future will hold. It's uncertain. We have no idea. And so facing systemic racism, which is the norm of our past, the norm of the past world over, in looking towards a future that will be different, that is good trouble.
Keep going. That is wonderful. So clearly this is an emotionally intelligent thing to do. But what is one thing that people can do to really, individuals, companies, CEOs, the person that, maybe their only interaction is going to a grocery store because they're COVID aware or COVID scared. What one thing could you ask something of, or ask someone to do to help them move forward at this particular time in this particular area of systemic racism and trying to evolve from that quite significantly?
There's two things in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
So the two things in parallel are everyone needs to recognize what influential leadership is. To be able to influence anybody, it doesn't matter who you're influencing. Somebody will buy into what you have to say because they like you. Everybody has somebody who likes them. And that's what influential leadership is. It's just the people who already like you, and they will pay attention to you just because they like you. Now, what are they paying attention to? That's where you have the second part of it, is continuing to learn, continuing, if you're a book reader, to read books, listen to podcasts, to read articles, to follow the news, to see what's happening, and really look inside yourself to see, if you're a faith-based person, to see what your faith tells you is your next step. If you're not a faith-based person, what other parts of your own morality tell you is the next step. And so the growth is the important piece here. And so you'll be influencing others while you're learning. So you're learning and influencing in a simultaneous way. So it's the two things that are happening. And those things together, your peer group, and the people that care about you will grow together. We'll all influence each other together, and eventually we'll get there.
Very well said. It's very nice. Thank you. No, it's wonderful. You've nearly brought me to tears, because it's one of those things that you're right. The power is in ourselves, and I think power is too strong a word, but we have the ability to influence, and we have to learn and understand and adapt, find the language, communicate it, and have those quite brave discussions with other people where they may not be there yet, and then to be able to receive that feedback simultaneously. That's
There's a couple of points to avoid in this whole process.
Please. Yeah, we don't want to just set people out there.
Righteousness is one of those points to avoid. We tend to learn something, and then we're like, ooh, I now know something other people don't know. I need to get them influenced so they can also be on the same level with me. Recognizing that we're all moving through this at our own pace, and there's a wave of what happens when you start to learn something, especially learn something that is painful. And it starts with skepticism, either skepticism that you can't do anything about it, or that there's nothing that needs to be done. The next step is then frustration, either like it's not happening fast enough, it doesn't feel good yet, I thought I was on the right track. So there's a frustration phase. And then there gets to a negotiation phase, like, okay, I'm willing to be frustrated. I'm willing for this to not feel good. What do we have to do next? What do we have to do to get there? And then the fourth part is really getting to the execution of like, okay, I'm willing to read more, willing to do more. I'm willing to change a policy. I'm willing to talk to my kids. I'm willing to stand up in front of people. And those 4 steps, that skepticism, frustration, negotiation, and then eventually to execution of actually doing things. But you can't just jump to the execution, or you didn't go through the process like deep down.
Nicole, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on this podcast. I'm so glad we did this, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
You too. Thanks, Caroline.
Take care.